Welcome back to Fast Freddy RC, and today I want to talk about the Tamiya ORV chassis. I think it's worth doing because it was one of their most prominent new chassis designs at the time, and it wasn't based on any real vehicle out there in the world. And they created some amazing models based off of that chassis. Now the funny thing is, it was never termed an ORV chassis by Tamiya. It was a space frame design, but Tamiya enthusiasts actually ended up coining the term an ORV, so an off-road vehicle chassis. So that wasn't a Tamiya thing, that was simply named by the fans. Now the interesting thing is, it all started with the frog. Are you catching me on that? No, it didn't. It's actually the SUBARU BRAT was the very first vehicle to use the ORV chassis. A lot of people get it wrong. They assume that the frog was the one that introduced it because it was very popular, but it was actually the SUBARU BRAT, and that part number was 58038. And then it was the frog, part number 58041. But here's the really cool thing. The frog is the only buggy vehicle using the ORV chassis. You think about all of the different vehicles that Tamiya produces. The ORV chassis was only ever used for one buggy, then which was the frog. The BRAT wasn't considered a buggy, and then of course the LANCIA, what was it? The LANCIA Rally Edition, which was in November 21st of 83, that wasn't considered a buggy. So it is the first and only buggy design on the ORV chassis. So first we had the BRAT. That was introduced in July 30th of 83. Then there was the LANCIA Rally, which was introduced in 83 too, but that was on November 21st. Then the Frog, 58041, which was introduced in December 16th, 1983. So its popularity grew because the other thing was, because it wasn't based on any design of any real car out there, they started naming their vehicles by basically naming them after animals, and then having like this one has, no guts, no glory, and a lot of their vehicles from that point, they started having their own little tag phrase on their models. So it was great because the space frame design meant that there was plenty of room for all of the electronics. It was a new design. I mean, back in the day with mine, obviously this is an electronic speed controller now because this is a new model, but it would have been a servo and then the 3-step speed controller, which was here. And it had it was a friction damper units on the front, right? There's no springs, there's no shocks here. They were just damper units. And then of course the transmission. Now I know on the BRAT, when it first came out, it didn't even have a differential in the back here. But this was an amazing design, which actually ended up taking over. A lot of the official racers would start using this design for, or this model frame for a lot of the races that Tamiya was doing. So it became a competition vehicle. But there are drawbacks. One of the things that I know was a major concern was the gearbox, because it wasn't that great, in that if you were to upgrade from the 540 motor to anything else, you'd end up stripping the gears. And I know on my BLACKFOOT, the problem I always had was the hex drive shafts, right? The hex drive shafts would wear out, and then you had nothing, so you had to order more drive shafts to make it work. Now obviously in the updated models they've done a wishbone design, so they fixed that. The gearbox is still the old gearbox, so I mean, if you want to hop this up like crazy, it's probably not the vehicle you want to do that with, because you're going to probably end up ordering more gears all the time, and that's probably not even worth it. But I picked this one up because for me this is what started it all, because I intended on getting that one as a kid, but as we know in a different video, I ended up getting the BLACKFOOT because that was the next model that came out that appealed to me, and it was the same chassis, but now it was a truck, and I was kind of excited about that. So, you've got the ORV chassis here with the friction dampers on the front. That's it. And then, of course, put that aside, the Blackfoot comes out. Now the Blackfoot all of a sudden gave you more protection for your radio gear, for one, because you now have, they built these so that you could actually have proper shocks on the front, and they had the casing that was protecting a lot more of the radio gear. As you can see with the ORV chassis, it doesn't really protect that in the buggy mode, but it's pretty much the same design on the back, same gearbox, everything else. So again, you couldn't really do a lot of upgrades to it because you're bound to strip out the gears. But the thing that is really interesting is, you know, the ORV chassis was popular, people were using it, but then when they brought out their big wheel series, okay, their big wheel series, which started with the Blackfoot, the trucks and the monster trucks became very, very popular. I don't know if you remember the Marui Big Bear. I remember that when I'd go into hobby stores, and that was actually one of the very first to be produced. That was 1983-84, and then Tamiya came out with the Blackfoot, and this vehicle became a massive hit, which also meant that the big wheel series, the monster truck idea, became very, very popular, which in many ways I would say Tamiya started that off simply because of the popularity of the Blackfoot, and we're still using that ORV chassis. So that original one was 58058 in terms of a part number, and that was introduced on October 8th of 1986. Now from that point on, you had the Monster Beetle 58060, December 23rd of 86. Then the Mud Blaster 58077, April 11th of 89. Now, if you don't remember what the Mud Blaster was, it was essentially the identical chassis, but you were bringing back the Subaru BRAT body was on top of that. So that was the Mud Blaster. They basically repurposed the body and created a new model out of it. Then there was the Bush Devil 58101 on March 28th of 92. Now the Bush Devil was a bit more of a different, they beefed up the rear end. So now you could start doing a bit more with the back, in terms of upgrades for the chassis. Then there was the Super Blackfoot 58110 on December 3rd of 92. And finally, the last model to use the ORV chassis was the King Blackfoot, part number 58192, which was introduced July 10th of 1997. So this chassis went from 1983 to 1997, and it became one of Tamiya's most popular chassis. And I know that there are a lot of people out there that don't like the ORV chassis. Maybe it's because I was a kid when I first got mine, but I love building the ORV chassis. I love the model series that they created around that chassis. Is it outdated? Yes. Are they fun to drive? Absolutely. When I got my first Blackfoot, I mean, you think of the tires are on this. I wore those down. I think I had to switch the rears to the front and vice versa because I had no traction. And back then, as a kid, you don't have the money to, buy a whole new set of tires. But it was just, to me, was such fun, so easy to maintain, so easy to build, and it was easy access to everything in the kit, so it was very simple. So for me, the ORV chassis is worth basically paying homage to because it really has produced some of the most amazing Tamiya models since 1983. And remember, the BRAT was first, not the Frog. But, I know that the King Blackfoot came with a different gearbox so that you could start doing more upgrades, and changing the motors and whatnot weren't going to strip the gears. So it got better. But I still like building the older models, and quite honestly, I think I'll probably get a the Subaru BRAT at one point, simply because it was the first of the ORV series. And as a kid, I certainly remember those. You know, you'd see others with them, and I just think it would be very cool to build. I think one of the most amazing things about the ORV chassis is it's been used for almost a decade and a half on a lot of their different vehicles, and it was very popular. It was very easy to maintain, and you know, once they created the big wheel series, which again started in '86, it took off. It became a very popular vehicle, and to this day people are loving it. You know, one of the big changes when they went to the big wheel series is simply the friction dampers. Rather than having just the little spring and here that's pushing the suspension out on either side, which doesn't actually produce a lot of travel, you were able to get almost a full-size truck, and now you've got full-on suspension, front and rear. You know, the other thing that was a major change is that obviously in the older versions, the shocks were parallel to the chassis, whereas on the newer models, including the King Blackfoot, the shocks are up and down, which, you know, again, they used the same chassis, but it was a completely different design. And of course, with this one, the Monster Beetle and everything else were parallel. So obviously in that list, I'm only including the vehicles that were introduced first during that decade and a half. I'm not including vehicles like this one, which was the Blackfoot that was introduced in 2016. Obviously there's a different part number, but it's still ORV chassis, but it's just a re-release. You know, obviously, I'm sure many of you know that Tamiya no longer has the relationship with Ford, so the re-release don't have the Ford emblem or the Ford, well, they're the Ford logo on the front, and they don't have the Ford on the back, so they've just, you know, replaced it with Blackfoot, and there's nothing on the front now. Doesn't matter, but I mean, obviously their licensing agreement ran out. So I'm not counting those models. But I think it's really cool to see the lineage in those almost 15 years from '83 to '97 and which vehicles were on this ORV chassis. So there you have it, the history of the Tamiya ORV chassis. Absolutely loved actually putting this together. It was kind of cool to actually put all of the different models in line to see which came first and which was the last. So I enjoyed that. I hope you did too. Please subscribe. There'll be more content on the way, and we'll see you in the next video.